Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for making time in your busy schedules and joining us today. We listen to Jee Leong Koh, who is a prolific writer, poet, and translator. This event is hosted by Compass, the Comparative Literature and Intercultural Studies Graduate Student Organization, in collaboration with the Wilson Center for Arts and Humanities. Compass is a small and humble student organization with a membership count of less than 40. When we first decided to host Jee Leong Koh, we thought it would be an event hosted by our department only. But something unexpectedly wonderful happened soon after. The Wilson Center decided to make this event a part of their Global Georgia Initiative public event series, and we were beyond thrilled, of course. It was a milestone for us as a student organization. I would like to thank the Wilson Center for their continued support in different ways to the cause of the arts and the humanities, especially Nicholas Allen and Dave Marr for helping us turn this event into a university-wide one. I would like to thank everyone in our department for supporting us and giving us their love, especially our magnanimous business manager, Jill Talmadge. I would also like to thank Dr. Peter O'Neill for his guidance and helping us make this event a success. And now I would like to hand it over to Professor Aruni Kashyap, who is a well-known writer and poet in his own right, and an assistant professor of creative writing at the University of Georgia.
Thank you, Subrina Deka. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce my dear friend Jee Leong Koh, who is perhaps the most widely known writer from Singapore today. Jee is the author of 4 books of poems, 7 studies for a self-portrait published by Bench Press in 2011, Equal to the Earth, Bench Press 2009, Payday Loans, poems published in 2007, um, The Pillow Book, Matte Paper Press 2012, and Sleep Tea, Carcanet Press. The Pillow Book was shortlisted for the Singapore Literature Prize. Sleep Tea was named the Best Book of the Year in 2015 by UK's Financial Times. It is also a finalist for the 28 Lambda Literary Awards in the Gay Poetry category. Last year, which is 2020, he published a stunning an experimental novel that I have just started reading. It's called Snow at 5 p.m. Translations of an Insignificant Japanese Poem. It is published by Bench Press in 2020 September. It is set in New York City. It's about a lot of debate over a book of haikus that have been found in a fireplace, and it's written in the form of commentary. It's a really delightful read. I have just started reading it, and I was talking about it before this program began. In 2020, he also released a collection of poems with sibling rivalry press called Connor and Seal. And in some ways, I think it queers the canon of American poetry. Uh, Originally from Singapore, Jee now lives in New York City. He is the organizer of the inaugural Singapore Literature Festival in New York. He curates the arts website, Singapore Poetry, Singapore Unbound, and the second. He also curates the second Saturday reading series, where I have had the pleasure of reading via Zoom this year. He also is a publisher of Gaudy Boy Press. They award the Gaudy Boy Poetry Prize annually to any writer around the world of Asian heritage. This year, they have also started a translation imprint, which is a very important contribution to American literature and culture, because very few books in American literature in America are actually originally translated. So this translation imprint is called Gaudy Boy Translates. G is an amazing literary citizen. You know, he makes the world better, and he is very generous. The work that he's doing is cutting edge, and I have just a lot of admiration for him. And so I'm very happy that he is today speaking at the Department of Comparative Literature and Intercultural Studies at the University of Georgia. A very big welcome to you, G, and thank you so much, Sabrina, for giving me this opportunity to introduce him.
Thank you so much, Aruni, for that introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me to read And I want to thank also Subralina for actually organizing this event. There were so many emails back and forth, and I really, really appreciate the fact that you were, so efficient and so effective in getting everything going. Very much want to thank Peter and Dave too for supporting this event. So very good afternoon to everybody. Thank you so much for actually spending your time with us this afternoon. I am going to say a little bit about my background so that you know where the work actually comes from. And in doing so, I am going to speak really very much as a writer and not as a translator. In fact, I'm not a translator, I'm a writer. Now, the title of my talk is Translation as a Literary Trope. As you will very quickly discover, I hope, translation as a literary trope interests me a great deal, all right, because of my own personal background, but also as a kind of a literary obsession, all right, of mine. And I really very much approach that topic as a trope and not as a translator myself. So I'm going to say a little bit about my background, and then afterwards, I'm actually going to read some excerpts from my work of hybrid fiction, Snow at 5 p.m., translations of an insignificant Japanese poet. I am from Singapore. As many of you may know, Singapore was a former British colony, right? And same as other former British colonies, when the British were ruling the colonies, they practiced a divide and rule approach strategy, right, to governance. So in Singapore, Singapore's population was divided into various racial categories: the Chinese, the Indians, meaning the South Asians, the Malays, who are seen as the people native to the region, and others, which is of course a category that can encompass so much variety, including the Jews, Arabs, as well as what we call the Peranakan people who have been in the region for a long time, have intermarried actually with the local Malays. So in Singapore right now, 75% of the population is Chinese, 15% is Malay, and 7% is Indian. So as you can tell from the statistics, Singapore is very, very much dominated by this Chinese majority. And by and large, they have continued this neo-colonial style of actually ruling the country, the strategy that I've just described as to divide and rule. And this can be seen in the language policy of the country. So, Malay is actually seen as a national language because it is the language of the people native to the region, but it is hardly used, all right, from day to day. Instead, English is actually promoted in the country as well as in schools. So everybody will actually study English in school and study all the other subjects, including math and science in English as well. All right, and they will study one more subject, one more language, all right, which is their so-called mother tongue. Now, English is seen as the language of globalization, helping Singaporeans to connect with the rest of the world. And the mother tongue is supposedly the language of values transmission to help you stay connected, all right, with your own cultural values. But interestingly, of course, in Singapore, all right, the mother tongue that is promoted for the Chinese in Singapore is Mandarin. So even though actually large proportions of the Chinese population speak other Chinese languages, such as Cantonese or Hainanese or Hokkien, everybody's supposed to speak Mandarin instead. That is the language that's offered in schools. The situation is very different for the Indian community in Singapore. They are actually encouraged to actually learn their so-called other mother tongue. So there are actually various Indian languages that are available actually for their study. And this is, of course, one way of ensuring that the Chinese majority, all right, are unified, all right, in their identity and in seeing themselves as a dominant part of the country. Whereas, of course, then the Indian community will remain more committed to their regional identities. And that is just a simple, small example of how the practices, the ruling practices of the British have been carried over in this neo-colonial context. So personally, I studied English, and I also came from an English-speaking family, but I also actually spoke Cantonese as well. But I actually think in English, I write in English, I read in English. And fortunately for me, the system really, really benefited me. As a result, I was able to actually win a scholarship to Oxford University in the UK, where I actually studied English as a subject. As I'm sure you're very well aware, the UK universities do not offer a liberal arts curriculum like the American universities do, because you have to decide on your subject even before joining the university. So from the very outset, I already decided to study English. And in my time there, many, many years ago now, the English curriculum at Oxford, was rather narrow, shall we say, because it's really about literature of the United Kingdom. We would actually study literature from the Old English period right up to the 20th century, what we would like to call, from Beowulf to Seamus Heaney. And you're allowed to take American literature, but only as an elective in your final year. So you can see how parochial that kind of a curriculum is. It's very, very much focused on English, British history, literature, rather than looking actually beyond itself. And so it is with that education and that training that I went back to Singapore to actually begin my public school teaching. And the system in Singapore is still very much beholden to the UK. So, our major exams, our national examinations, all right, are actually examinations conducted by the Cambridge Board of Examination. So, the examinations that our students write are actually sent to the UK for grading, and the grades are actually returned to us. It's all part of this, neo-colonial mindset that this is something that we're not quite able to do for ourselves, but we have to look to England or to Great Britain, all right, for. Having done that for a number of years, I was really, really wanting to actually come out as a gay man. And I also wanted to see how good I was as a poet. And with those two aims in mind, I moved to New York City in 2003, enrolling myself in the MFA program at Sarah Lawrence College. It was, of course, a wonderful 2 years, all right, because I had all the time in the world to read and write. And I studied with really fantastic poets such as Marie Howe, Stephen Doddins, and Vijay Seshadri. But I must say too, on hindsight, looking back, I do wish that I had the opportunity to actually work with poets of color who might actually have challenged this rather Eurocentric, British-centric views that I have of poetry and the craft of writing as well. But I did not have such teachers. And it was only when I actually joined Kundiman, which is a literary organization set up to actually promote and develop Asian American writers, that I began to discover a world outside of what I was actually used to, accustomed to. So it was at a Kundiman retreat where we actually all, workshop our poems, were taught by wonderful Asian American poets, that I actually began to actually know of, other traditions, right, beyond the narrowly British one. And subsequently, I took a workshop with the poet Kimiko Han, who is of German and Japanese heritage. And that workshop really, really changed my whole view of craft and of poetic forms. Because in that workshop, Kimiko Han introduced us to a wide range of Japanese forms, not just the haiku, not just a senryu, but also, most wonderfully, the zuihitsu, which I loved. And I wrote a collection of that, as you have heard from Aruni. And what the Japanese forms helped me to do is really expand my idea of poetic forms. Because so many of these Japanese forms, the aesthetic aims seem so different from the aims of the forms that I was very much used to. And that really, really was very useful to me in challenging myself to grow as a writer. So after all that, what I was doing after my MFA was that I actually was lucky enough to get a job teaching in a private school, independent school in New York City on the Upper East Side. And when I was living on the Upper West Side, I walked to school every day across Central Park. As you can imagine, it was a lovely walk in all seasons. And as I was doing this, daily walk to school, I began, writing haiku, one a day, about, Central Park, about the walk. It was, of course, a natural form to gravitate to think about nature and our relationship to nature. But at the same time, I was also thinking about, my own relationship to the US, in particular to the land that I was actually walking on. It was a tricky question because I was asking myself, what claims, if any, do I have to the country or to the land? None, of course, because in a sense, I am not an American citizen. I am a permanent resident for a number of years, but I'm still not a resident. I'm still not a citizen. And then, of course, in other words, I'm just still an immigrant of sorts. And yet, there was a part of me that thought, well, walking this ground is a kind of investment of my life in this place. And whether I like it or not, I become part of this place very, very much so. It is not as if I own anything, because it is not about ownership, it's not about possession, it's not about property. It's really about living in a place, which I think has a tremendous value in itself, that someone else who have never lived in a place may not share or may not understand. And so as I was grappling my way, finding my way to this idea, at a conference, I met with the French poet and translator, Nicolas Pesquis, who actually said something that helped to crystallize my own thinking. And he said this: to write is to embody. To translate is to trace corporeally the same path that the first body took. The impossibility of translation is the impossibility of two bodies occupying the same space at the same time. And that really blew me because I was thinking about my walk through Central Park and how I was walking after so many people who walked before me, right? That does not mean, of course, that I'm negligible, all right? But it certainly meant that others have walked, before me, and I'm actually walking in their footsteps, so to speak. And to translate would mean that I am following their footsteps, following their path. Now, I cannot occupy the same space as they do. And that is what Nicolas Pesquis referred to as the impossibility of translation, right? Because we have also a kind of bodily integrity. We can't be someone else. We can't merge with someone completely. And that is important to always, for me to remind myself. Because of course, while I want to value the integrity of my body and integrity of my own experience, I also want to acknowledge there are other people beside me. And that is a very important, I think, ethical point for me. So when I write, for example, these haiku, I begin to also think about my own relationship to the Japanese tradition of haiku writing. How even though I am not Japanese myself, I can still have a relationship towards that, perhaps that is analogous to the relationship of translation and the original, right? That actually by framing my own original haiku as pseudo translations, all right, from a Japanese original into English, I would be signaling the fact of my distance, all right, from the original Japanese tradition, while still actually finding some connection to it. So that was what I did. I started writing this haiku. I started thinking of them as kind of pseudo translations, and I started sending them out to various magazines and journals, and they all came back rejected by various editors. And I was kind of surprised, a little bit anyway. And whatever comments I get from editors, right, they would basically revolve around two reservations about a haiku. First thing, there is this idea, I think, in America and even in the UK, that the haiku is a very easy and juvenile form. It's a form that you would teach like, lower schoolers, third graders or fourth graders to get them to write poetry. So it's seen as juvenile. And the other reservation has to do with the fact that haiku is felt to be too short for some kind of like emotional immersion, all right, in the poem. So people didn't know what to do with it because before, you enter the haiku and then before you know it, you're out of it because there are only like 3 lines, 17 syllables, right? All right, so to speak. And so that really, really intrigued me because I thought I have discovered something about the Western aesthetic tradition that resists the haiku. And these points of resistance, right, became really, really points of investigation and exploration for me. I was then absolutely bent on actually publishing these haiku. But at the same time, I also want to actually produce a longer narrative, a longer prose accompaniment that would actually help American readers who may be resisting the haiku to find their way in. And that was when I hit upon the idea of writing this prose accompaniment in the form of commentaries on the haiku. The idea came about because, of course, the haiku in Japan historically have been accompanied by, the tradition of commentary. So, there are many, many, many commentaries written about these famous haikus by Basho or Issa or other people. So that was one source of inspiration, the haiku commentary tradition. And then the other source of inspiration has to do with the Bible commentary. So I was formerly a Christian, so I was kind of familiar with the tradition of Bible commentary. In particular, the commentary on, what I went on to find out more about is the commentary on the Torah. Because what began to form in my mind is this fictional commentator by the name of Sam Fujimoto Maya, who has a double heritage. He is both Japanese as well as Jewish. All right, and I really wanted to bring these two traditions together, the Japanese commentary tradition as well as the Jewish commentary tradition together to see, all right, how they overlap and how they actually differ. Right. So I am going to actually read you from Snow at 5 p.m. And before I do that, I just want to share with you a little bit more about Sam Fujimoto Maya's family tree. Can you all see it? Yes. All right. It's too small, really, for you to look at it very carefully. I just want to show you, all right, that there are two sources, right? From the Japanese side of the family as well as the Jewish side of the family, leading, of course, to Sam Fujimoto Maya himself over here. Okay. And the book is laid out in this way. So on the left page, you will actually see the haiku, and then on the right page, you will have the commentary. And the commentary runs, over more than a page. It will remain on the right page. And so, of course, the left facing page will be blank. And I also find that very interesting to look at because you have the commentary, but then you also have the blankness and the absence that would actually accompany a second page or a third page of the commentary. Right, so I'm going to return to this family tree for a moment while I read to you the preface, all right, of Snow at 5 p.m., which is written by Sam Fujimoto Maya. It has been 50 years since the publication of Snow at 5 p.m., and the slim volume continues to expand in light and darkness. The light comes from the growing recognition of the astonishing quality of the haiku. Leading critics have compared the poems favorably with the best of Busan and Issa and placed them within the fragrant shade of Basho. The foremost haiku scholar of our day, Yamamoto Kenkichi-san of Tokyo University, who had held out against the tide of opinion, finally added his voice to the swelling chorus. In the esteemed journal Frog's Spawn, he judged the poetry to be of, quote, the highest order, end quote. The expanding darkness has, of course, to do with the mystery of the author's identity. The poems have been scrutinized for clues from many different directions: post-structural, psychogenic, piscatorial, painful. Innumerable hypotheses have been advanced based on the flimsiest but newest thought. The most intriguing speculations make use of the latest research methodologies. Armed with the biggest database of poetry ever assembled, Professor Ethan Cho at Columbia University deployed computer modeling of recurring tropes to show a very strong link to the writings of the utopian traveler William Guest. No one has, however, proven that Guest knew Japanese. The fact that the poems are in English translation, that the Japanese originals are missing, further complicates the search. We are at the mercy of the inexact art of translation, let alone the skill of the translator. Jee Leong Koh, the translator of Snow, is the subject of a busy secondary industry. Koh discovered the half-destroyed manuscript when he moved into his Upper West Side apartment in New York City in 2011. He proceeded to translate the haiku and publish them himself. Like so many writers before and after him, Koh moved from elsewhere, in his case Singapore, to New York, in search of immortal fame. And like so many before and after him, achieved a temporary notoriety. He died choking on a sausage, egg, and cheese sandwich on an everything bagel. No one was around in the Brooklyn neighborhood of Bushwick at the wee hours of the morning to perform the Heimlich. Gone with the wind was any information about the manuscript. We have only Koh's patently uninformative note to go on. On the 50th anniversary of the publication of Snow, I humbly offer my own notations, a labor of love over the course of a long and eventful life. I was 13 years old when the volume first appeared in 2016, and I still remember the shock of recognition it afforded me as I perused its contents as a 15-year-old with vague poetic pretensions in Vinnie's barber shop. While Vinnie himself was gripping oh so lightly my tender skull with his thick but well-manicured fingers, the poetic revelation came with the force of the first experience of sex, the fumble of understanding, the sweet intuitions. The thin book, with covers that were yellow first by design and then by age, has kept me company from Cincinnati, Ohio, the birthplace of American Reform Judaism and so much else, to Stanford University, where I studied comparative literature before dropping out, and finally to New York City, which has been my home and shelter for the past 40-odd years. New York City has undergone great changes during the time. The author of Snow will not recognize his beloved Central Park. Because of chronic water shortages, watchtowers with oscillating guns now guard the reservoir against the tenements of lower Manhattan. The less adaptable flora, including the poet's favorite forsythia, have given up their ghosts to the rising temperatures. Fleeing the floods, Wall Street now occupies Harlem. The so-called new civil rights movement has succeeded in catapulting selected colored and transgender persons over the walls and keeping the huddled masses out. Where I am held, high above Hell's Kitchen, I can see Central Park. The zoo is gone, but I can no longer enter it. This commentary is offered as a way of preserving the park as a public commons, if not in actuality, then in the imagination. Sam Fujimoto Maya, New York City, July 10, 2066. Now I will read you the first excerpt from the haiku. It's too hard in spring to study seriously the curriculum of trees. It is madness to drop out of your studies to join a buddy on a road trip across the country, but love is a kind of madness. I met Damien Strange at Stanford's Green Library, not our usual specs, for I was typically catalogued in the East Asia Library, and Damien a pre-med student in Lane. Yet green was appropriate for a great number of reasons. The social sciences were the common ground on which we met, not the mathematical abstractions of economics, not the dusty minutiae of jurisprudence, but the heaving and heady forces of political theory. Coming from a household of artists, I was looking to toughen my love of beauty with the power of judgment. Damien, descended from a distinguishable line of surgeons and hospital administrators, was seeking to soften the judgment of power with the beauty of love. Then followed days, weeks, months of reading and debate, with the river of undergraduate fervor running through it. Damien deployed his hops to dismiss my Hayek. My Sartre was marshaled against his Schmidt. When Damien got too strong, I fell back on my race and gender theories to ambush him as he came around the corner of an argument. He wrestled me to the floor of his dorm room when my tongue got too bayonet sharp for his liking. By the time the dust settled and the fog cleared, we discovered we had exchanged places. He was in the jungle with Frantz Fanon, and I in the senior common room with Richard Rorty. Our political action was not limited to our books. We engaged in campus protests, citywide marches, cafeteria sit-ins. In 2021 and 2022, there was plenty to get angry about, what with the start of Trump's second term. Throughout the clamor of campaigning, Damien fell in and out of a succession of raven-haired women, installing first one and then another in the Oval Office of his heart. Recognizing the healthy instincts of a heterosexual male, I played the part of his chief of staff. When he grew tired of all the political interventions and romantic liaisons and proposed a road trip, I hopped into his Toyota Yaris and we ended up in New York City. Then followed a languorous mood, so charmingly evoked by the haiku, when freed from political agitation and intellectual furrow, we roamed the city streets, lolled in the parks, and ate at literal holes in the wall. The knowledge that we had quit school, an action more real than any protests against the killing of yet another Black kid, whetted our appetite for life. In Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Father, Rabbi Yaakov admonishes, were one to be walking on the road while studying and then stop his studies to say, how beautiful is this tree and how nice is this field, such a person would be considered by the Torah to have sinned against his soul. We were guilty, joyously guilty, of taking a time out. The mood was not to last long. It ended abruptly when Damien met Ada Chen, the tar-haired Taiwanese. The wind is rising. I'm listening to the dark tints of a crow etching. There is no avoiding it. I have to speak of what I'm most loath to do. The wind is not just rising, but battering at my skull. Damien Strange and crow-haired Ada Chen met at Belvedere Castle at the exact midpoint of Central Park. Like the stagey venue, the meeting was a Victorian folly. I was looking for the umpteenth time for a vantage point from which I could see the whole of Turtle Pond when Damien wandered from my side into the family-friendly exhibit in the observatory tower. A display of telescopes and microscopes was posed and supposed to teach the naturalist way of looking. More portentous of the disaster of their romance were the birds' skeletons and feathers on show. By the plywood tree, Under a papier-mâché red-breasted nuthatch, they walked into each other, literally. I have always suspected that Ada spotted Damien from a distance and bumped him with full lascivious intentions. Their chests met with a jolt, and then, in the confusion, Damien's hands were introduced briefly to Ada's breasts through her I Heart Taiwan t-shirt, but not brief enough to prevent the extension of the telescope in his shorts. After bidding me a hurried goodbye, Damien left the arbor of ardor with Ada for somewhere more private, at a wind speed that destroyed the delicate measuring instruments of the National Weather Service. When the nun Taishin learned that Ryokan Taigu was visiting the nearby castle town of Yoita, she hurried there to meet the famous monk and poet. Originally from a samurai family, Taishin was not slow to strike. Coquettishly, she teased the monk. Your complexion is dark and your robe is dark, so from now on, I will call you a crow. Ryokan was supposedly so tickled by this none too subtle come on that he sent her this poem. Tomorrow, I will fly away to who knows where, as someone has made me a crow. In response, Taishin wrote, "O mountain crow, if you are going home, please bring along a young crow, even one with fragile wings." Damien and Ada became inseparable. I was sometimes allowed to tag along, at which times I cleverly endeavored to get into Ada's good book. She has only one, so that she would not put a full stop to our joint outings. She largely ignored me, so sure she was of her victory. If she was crowing, so was I. I was feeding on the carrion of my friendship with Damien. He had found his love, and I had nothing. I'm going to stop here. All right. This time is getting on. So that was just like one of many, many love stories that, thread their way through the commentary. So I hope you can hear from the commentary that it is at once a commentary on the haiku, but also tells the family story, the family saga of Sam Fujimoto Maya, the history of his family in the US. Yeah, thank you very, very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Jee. And I think Aruni was going to start the questions up, but if anyone, hold on, I think he's had to leave. I know he's, yeah, he has had to leave, and he does he does apologize. So if you wish to ask a question of Jee, then use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat. And we will try and fit in your question. And I see Dr. Mori, head of our department, has got a question. And it's this, Jee. Does Shinglish have a place in your function and or poetry?
Thank you so much for that question. I would have to say no. Singlish, which is informal name for Singaporean English, is a mixture of English and Mandarin and Malay and Tamil, all the various languages we have in Singapore. And I do know of some younger poets who have actually attempted to use Singlish in their poetry. But I guess, I belong to that generation when basically for me to write poetry means writing in a certain register and style of English, that if I had attempted to actually include Singlish into my poetry, it would have struck a comic note. And still, I think right now it is very much used in poetry, even by the younger writers, all right, for the sake of generating comedy. right? The situation is very different for our playwrights, because in Singapore, playwrights, of course, are after theatrical realism. So they want to actually reproduce the way people speak. But I've always thought of poetry as something much, much more personal, even obscure. And somehow, because of my own experience of growing up, I have not really included Singlish into my writing, even though I speak it to other Singaporeans. But thank you for that question.
Subrilina.
Right, Jee, I have a question for you next. So is this act of considering translation as a literary trope for you, a means, a language of sorts of negotiating your own identity in a foreign land, maybe?
Yes, very much so. That's a great question. Because translation, of course, in its original meaning means carrying over, right? So to translate is to carry over the meaning from one language, right, to the target language. And so for me, it applies also to my own migration, right, to America. So I do see myself as translating myself, from Singapore to New York, for instance. But it also, refers, I think for me, very metaphorically, of course, to the actual act of writing. That when I have ideas in my head, I think of myself as translating them into words. And of course, you write something and you feel that the writing will never capture the richness or the complexity of what you have in that head. So, I think translation is an apt metaphor there because, of course, in translation, we're very used to the idea of the losses, right? They come with translation. So too, the act of writing for me is always accompanied by some kind of loss, because it will never, never achieve the kind of depth, the kind of velvety, texture, or the kind of vividness, right? That's something we have in my head. Yeah. So that too, I think I have to reckon with.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Jee. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions, but first of all, I like when you started out, you explained a little bit of the history of Singapore and British under the British colonial system, and it's a link with me as an Irish person. Too, we were England's first colony. They practiced everything first, including the decimation of the Irish language. And I get very frustrated because my Irish, I'm not a fluent speaker, yet it seems like my tongue is being taken out from me. Do you have a similar feeling about your relationship to English and your own cultural background from going back generations?
Yeah. No, that's just really, really, interesting question, right? Because we all come so differently, isn't it? All right, to English because of history, because of family, and because of our own personal experiences. So as I mentioned, my family actually spoke English, which is unusual for a Chinese family. In Singapore, you will speak Chinese or you speak one of the Chinese dialects. And I think it has to do with the fact that my family can trace their origins back to the Peranakan people who have been around in Singapore and Malaysia for a while. And this group of people actually were, many of them were English speaking because it benefited them to actually work with the British government of the day, right, in some kind of capacity. So I'm a beneficiary of that. Mm-hmm. So for me, it is, historically determined, but also family. So I mean, I grew up just hearing English all the time, with mixed with other languages, sure, but I do not know any other language, right? So when I write, it's not as if I have a choice. I don't have a choice, right? Between English and some other language, I have to write in English because that's what I'm most fluent and adept in. But nevertheless, of course, there is also that process of reckoning with one's heritage, isn't it? Including one's colonial heritage, and more, of course, I find that I have to be very mindful of how I have adopted the language, sometimes with unexamined assumptions. And therefore I would have to examine those assumptions. For example, I love to write in the sonnet form, right? Which is, of course, in English, of course, is Shakespeare is the giant, right, of that form. And so when I write in the sonnet form, for example, I have to think about why I'm doing so and how I can actually change it or subvert it in some way to indicate a kind of resistance, a kind of otherness that cannot be captured by the form, perhaps, right? As conventionally conceived, right? So that I think is a spur to me to create, to change things up, and I find it very useful as a writer. So that is my way of dealing with the language and my own linguistic inheritance. But it's also something that I know I cannot do without.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. I've got Philip Che has actually got two questions. So I'll ask the first one. Why did you specifically choose a combination of Japanese and Jew in the creation of Sam? Actually, seems like it's three questions. Both ethnicities can sometimes be seen as isolationist. Was that a conscious choice to merge these two identities?
Yeah, when I mentioned it in my introduction that what first led me to creating a Jewish / Japanese American character or commentator was the fact that of the tradition of commentaries that lie behind them, right? The haiku commentary as well as the commentaries on the Torah. Uh, so that was what first brought me to this idea. But then as I explore this, strand further, we can find many, many similarities actually between the Japanese and the Jewish American people or Japanese Jewish people in general. Both peoples are people of the book. Yeah, very much so. And they value learning highly. I know these are very, very broad and crude generalizations, but you can support them too, nevertheless. And in the context of America, what intrigued me was how we very often talk about, the experience of Jews in during the Holocaust as something that happens out there in Europe, far away from us. But what, of course, the Japanese Americans' experience of incarceration, right, during World War II, tell us, of course, is that no, it's actually happening. It actually happened here, right, in America. It is not somewhere else. It actually happened here. And of course, scholars have, pointed out that a lot of Hitler's ideas, right, about anti-Semitic ideas, ideas about racial purification, actually came from America. So in fact, Hitler actually praised the American government, for all its extreme anti-foreigner immigration legislation, and saying they are keeping their race pure. This is what we need to do, So for the longest time, scholars who have looked at Nazi anti-Semitism have not seen the connection because they've been tracing it back to Middle Ages in Europe, right? Because they're just looking at anti-Semitism. But if you broaden the lens, looking at it as racist, then you realize that America is very much implicated, all right, in the formulation of Nazi policies. And so again, that became a point of connection that I wanted to make in my work. Many other points. I'll just mention one more, and that is, of course, that wonderful story of, that name just escaped me for a moment. The Japanese embassy official in Lithuania, who actually helped many Jewish people to escape. All right, by actually writing out, passports so that they can actually leave the country to first go to Japan before, escaping to other safe harbors. And, that was also another point of connection I thought was so interesting. And so I had in my kind of futuristic vision in the book, an imagining of how Japanese and Jewish Americans came together to form some kind of a national association, right, to actually promote immigration to fight against xenophobia, because I think these are two people who have experienced it very, very harshly, and therefore knew what it was all about.
Terrific. And Philip's second question, I'll go ahead. I don't know if Subralina may have a question from elsewhere, but let me ask Philip's. How did you come about creating your this is what I was interested in, the luxury of writing your own obituary, but how did you come about creating the fictional Jee Leong Koh's death? There's something mundane yet very New York about the way the character passed.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Philip, for your second question. And by the way, everybody, Philip just reminded me the name of the Japanese embassy official. Yeah, of course, he is Sugihara, isn't it? Right. Thanks, Philip. About your second question, yes, it's kind of fun, isn't it? I mean, to imagine one's death in the sense that then one imagines perhaps, kind of, that one can control it somehow, right? Very, very magically, all right? It is very, very New York. I wanted something that's very New York. I love New York. I cannot imagine living anywhere else in America. I love visiting other parts of America, but I always come back to New York as if I'm coming back home. And so I wanted something that was very, very New York. Now, why the particular kind of bagel? It's an everything bagel, because in Snow at 5 p.m., I'm really also trying to put everything that I know in it, so to speak, every scrap of information, every literary technique that I know. It's kind of a hold-all of everything that I've been learning, all right, about literature, about writing, and so forth. And so, what do you do? When you try to do too much, you choke on it. So just as, the fictional Jee Leong Koh does, he does choke on this everything bagel. It's too much for him.
Oh, I'm getting hungry. Talk of bagels. We may have time for one or two more questions. If you put your questions in the Q&A. I don't know if Subralina had another question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Jee, it's mentioned, at the back of your book here that Vladimir Nabokov's Pale Fire was a huge source of influence for you. So could you please talk more about that, about the structure of the book, how much of it did you borrow from him, and so on and so forth?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, yes, the structure of this book owes, a tremendous depth, right, to Pale Fire. Pale Fire, of course, is actually made up of a poem, right, and the commentary, all right, and the commentator himself, Charles Kinbot, is kind of crazy, right, because he wants the poet to actually write about his kingdom, right, in a way, and so in a way restore his kingdom back to him, all right, in his imagination. I translated that, of course, into in Snow at 5 p.m. into Central Park, because I imagine in the future that Central Park will be closed to the public. There will be guards around the reservoir because water becomes such a precious resource that Central Park would no longer be available to everybody. So we can only recover it, right, in imagination by writing about it. So that was one connection for me. But the idea that someone kind of like crazy would actually want in a very selfish and egotistical way for the poet to write about him, so for everything to be about him, struck me as a really acute psychological insight into commentators of all sorts, right? Or critics, so to speak. I know, because we like to think of literary criticism as a somewhat objective kind of a study, but nevertheless, of course, everything that's so personal in us actually is infused, right, into our criticism, just as it is, right? So too for translation as well. And so in my figure, Sam Fujimoto Maya, as you read on, you will discover that he is not all there. He too is slightly unhinged in a different way. And he will do something terrible, right, at the end of the book. That will only be revealed at the end of the book. right? So, the power of words and what we want words to do for us, to restore what has been lost, to make right, what is wrong, is such a human desire, right? But it can also be such a disastrous desire. And I think that was one of the big lessons that Pale Fire actually taught me.
Terrific. I would, before you go, I think people will be interested in what you're working on next or currently, both as a writer and as a publisher. Maybe you could let us know what's coming up.
Sure. I After publishing, I just published, finished revising and publishing. I just finished revising Snow at 5 p.m. last year, and it came out in October. So, I have been giving myself a bit of a break, to let the land lie fallow for a while to see what will actually grow in it. But in that process, I have gone back to my early years in New York. I've started looking at my diaries there, and I'm seeing the experiences that I record in my diary with, very different eyes. And I think I would like to actually write a whole suite of poems that actually look at that experience, from the eyes that I do have now. So that's vague. I know. I'm sorry, but I think I just celebrated my 51st birthday last Sunday. And so I guess there's cause enough to actually look back at your younger self and see, what on earth was he up to, at that time. So that's for my own personal writing. As a publisher, I am the publisher of a small indie press called Gaudy Boy, based in New York City. And our mission is to publish Asian authors from around the world, including America. We publish poetry, fiction, as well as literary nonfiction. So for poetry, we actually run an annual poetry book prize. So please spread the word, please submit your work. But we also publish fiction and nonfiction as well. We don't publish many books. We publish only about 3 books a year because we are all volunteers run. But we really put our heart and soul and mind, behind every book that we actually put out because we only publish books that we really believe in. This year, we launched a translation imprint. It's very exciting for us. And our very first book is an anthology of stories from the Philippines in 7 different languages. It's quite a groundbreaking anthology because, previous anthologies would have stories, translated from just one language, but this anthology has stories translated from 7 Philippine languages. So it would give the reader a really good sense of the contemporary writing scene that is not English in the Philippines. Of course, because of the way the global marketplace works, we are more familiar with Anglophone writing. But this is a chance to actually broaden the lens, right? To cast a light on writers that are unjustly neglected.
That's terrific. Actually, I must put you in touch, if you don't know her already, with Sarita C. in Los Angeles. She was brought up in Singapore, actually, but she's written The Decolonized Eye on Philippine American art and performance. But she would be very interested in that book, that anthology you mentioned. So definitely, I will send that information along, especially with the Singapore connection.
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter. Yeah, please.
Absolutely. Subralina, over to you.
Thank you. I think this will be the last question. So I think everybody here would like to know, what are some of the challenges that you faced while writing your book, Snow at 5 p.m.?
Oh, what are the challenges? Gosh. I really like what Paul Goodman says. I mean, I don't know whether you know his work. I mean, he's kind of out of fashion a little bit right now. He's a psychologist as well as a writer, poet as well. And in one of his essays, he talks about how all writing, while the writer is doing it, is avant-garde. We tend to think of the avant-garde as like a special category of writing, yeah. But he says that all writing, while the writer is doing, is avant-garde, because the writer, if he's a writer, is always pushing at the boundaries of what he knows, because he wants always to write something new. All right. And so we are, I mean, so that for me is always true. So every book that I put out, I always try to push myself to do something that I've never done before. And sometimes to do things that I hate. So for example, if I hate list poems. Poems are written in the form of a list. And therefore I decided I have to write a list poem. And therefore it actually generated and evolved and became my book of zuihitsu, which is actually full of lists. So that desire to, I think, constantly push the boundaries of what I can do and what I know, I think is what keeps me writing, because otherwise it'd be really boring to keep doing the same thing.
Right. Thank you so much, Jee. Thank you everybody for being here, making time, and thank you so much, Jee Leong Koh, for being with us today and just enlightening us a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Superlina.